Okay, we're going to take a look at a nonprofit set of financial statements. And the purpose of the presentation is just to get you familiar with what a nonprofit statement looks like, some of the things that are unique to nonprofit statements. I pulled Why Hunger down off the internet. This is a December 31 year end. It's comparative. So if we take a look at the table of contents, we're going to see statement of financial position, statement of activities, statement of functional expenses, statement of cash flows, and then the notes. Now, the statement of functional expenses, I like including that as a basic financial statement. You can alternatively put that information in the notes. This entity is elected to make it a basic statement. I kind of like doing that. All right, so let's go on and we'll take a look at the opinion real quick. We see here they've got an unmodified opinion. It says that the numbers are presented fairly, and then again we see the comparative year ends here. So you also see in this paragraph it talks about those financial statements that we looked at in the table of contents: statement of financial position, statement of activities, statement of functional expenses, statement of cash flows. So those are the statements that you normally would see in a not-for-profit. Now notice I said not-for-profit. We also say non-profit, same thing, either way. So now let's look at the financial statements. So here's the statement of financial position. We look on here, and most nonprofits, you're going to see a fair amount of cash. Hopefully they have plenty of cash, but being a nonprofit, sometimes not. But here we see this entity has plenty of cash. They also have investments, also contributions and accounts receivable. So these are the amounts that this entity has earned but not received. They also have fixed assets here and operating lease, right of use asset. So if a nonprofit has an operating lease that's more than 1 year, you're going to see lease liability down here, and you're going to see a right of use asset up here. Okay, let's continue. It's quite common to have accounts payable. Notice these are full accrual statements. If they were modified cash or cash basis, these accruals normally would not be in play. But you can tell these financials are created in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, the FASB standards. Okay, so we said they've got lease liabilities. We see that there. We also see two categories of net assets, one being without donor restriction, and then the other categories with donor restriction. So if a contributor restricts the money, it's going to show up in here. The other monies that are not restricted by a donor would appear here. Now you're going to see on the statement of activities, which in a business we call that an income statement. On a not-for-profit, we call it statement of activities. And you'll see that on the next page. If you look at the bottom, you'll see the top of that next page. When we look at the statement of activities, we're going to see the ending balance over here will tie back to these two balances for without donor restriction and with donor restriction. So let's go to the next page. Let's go ahead and go down to the bottom. You're going to see a total here of $4,016,560. So if we go back to the prior page, we're going to see 4,016,560. Okay, let's go back over here and notice on this statement of activities, there's three columns here. One for with donor restriction, one for without donor restriction, one with donor restriction, and then a total. So we just looked at the total at the bottom for the without donor restriction. Now let's look at the with donor restriction. We go down here, we see 793, 482. If we go back to the top here, we see 793, 482. I'm not going to walk you through that on the comparative numbers, but you would see the same agreement between the statement of activities and these two classifications of net assets for 22 as well. Okay, now let's look more at the statement of activities. And this represents the income and expenses for the years ending December 31 of 23 on this page. And on the next page, we'll see the same for 22. Now, again, keep in mind we've got these separate columns for without donor restriction activity and with donor restriction activity. Do you notice anything that looks a little funny in the expense section? So if you've never looked at not-for-profit statements, you look down here and you may be wondering, why does the with donor restriction column not have any expenses? Well, all expenses in a not-for-profit show up in the without donor restriction column. And notice as these restrictions are met, we're moving the money from this column over to this column. So we've got the 425,909. We're reducing this classification by that amount because this money was spent and shows up in these numbers. In other words, this not-for-profit met the restrictions of the donors, therefore it's being moved over into without donor restriction, where the expenses are showing up down here. So that's unique to not-for-profits to see a movement like that, but that's very common. Nonprofits can present just like one column and have the without donor restrictions at the top and then put the with donor restrictions down below. I prefer this type of presentation. You can see the money moving from here to here. I can see the totals for without and with over here. So if I want to see what the contributions are for the year, I can go boom, 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 and I can see all of that here. If these numbers are showing up down at the bottom, it just makes it a little harder to follow. So I prefer a presentation like this. Now, all of these revenues showing up on here, they're earned revenues. Otherwise, they wouldn't appear on this statement of activities. You've also got some investment income down here. You're seeing grants and contributions appearing up here. You're seeing some investment activity showing up down here, and then here's that release. Okay, now on the expenses, we see those here, and notice there's two main categories here, one for program services, one for support services. Those two categories should appear in a nonprofit statement. So the program services here, you can see 5 different programs, and then there's the expenses for each of the programs. So the expenses that are not a part of the main mission, so to speak, of the nonprofit, they show up here. If you're not for profit, proportionately you want the support services number to be a smaller percent of the total expenses. That means you're not using money for, say, overhead and salaries and those kind of things. That's not directly benefiting these main mission programs of the not-for-profit. Then we come on down and we see change in net assets. You can think of that as net income. If you were looking at a for-profit, that would be net income. Here it's change in net assets. So we see 421 here and 139 here. Those are positive numbers, which means the revenues exceeded the expenses, and therefore net assets are increasing. So that's a positive. Now, in a not-for-profit, you can have a negative number here, and that's okay. You just wouldn't want negative numbers all the time, because after a while that would mean you didn't have any money. A small profit, if you will, in a nonprofit is good, because you're becoming, or the nonprofit is becoming healthier over time. Then we see the statement of activities for the next year. I'm not going to spend any time here, but this is a comparative statement for the prior year, the same type presentation. Then we get to the statement of functional expenses, and this is unique to nonprofits. So all nonprofits, if they're presenting their financials in accordance with GAAP, or standards created by FASB, then they're going to present the statement of functional expenses, or they will put that information in the notes. What you'll see here is for each of those programs that we looked at earlier, you'll see the expenses for each of those, and then the totals for each of these will tie back in the statement of net assets. So when we look at the Grassroots Action Network, that's a program, we go down the bottom, we see 1.7 million. If we go back to the 23 statement of activities, we see that same number here. So the totals on the statement of functional expenses, they'll tie back to the statement of activities. Statement of functional expenses is just a breakdown of these numbers. So let's go back to statement of functional expenses, and we see those for program services. We also see support services, and so that's how that works. I won't take you through the 22 numbers. You see how that's working for the 23 numbers. And then we get to the statement of cash flows. Now, here we see cash flows from operating activities, also cash flows from investing activities. So the cash flows here, they're being generated by the operations of the nonprofit. These investing activities, that's where they're buying and selling investments. Sometimes you might buy or sell property, but we've got two categories here. You could have a financing activities category as well, but they don't have that in this statement. Notice that up top we start with change in net assets, 561,053. If you go back to the statement of activities, you're going to see that particular number, 423. There it is there, 561,053. So if we go back over here to the cash flow statement, that's going to be the first number here. So you start with that number, and then you show non-cash items such as depreciation, amortization, the realized gains, unrealized gains on investments, and then changes in accounts to get back down to the total net cash generated by operating activities. Now, this is the indirect method. You can use the direct method for not-for-profit. If you do, you're going to see categories such as contributions and then say expenses or payments. And then we get into the notes, and you're going to see that the nonprofit is telling you why they were created, when they were created, what their main missions are. And then we go on down, and a lot of this is boilerplate. You're going to see it in most not-for-profit statements. For instance, they're explaining here net assets without donor restrictions. And then there's some more generic information about the main accounts like cash and investments. They talk about fair value measurements. And then here they've got an endowment. They disclose that. I won't get into the particulars here because I'm just trying to give you an overview. And then we get back into notes that really tie back into the statement of financial position. So these totals here are going to tie back into that statement, but they're giving you the composition of their investments. If we go on down, we see the fair value disclosures. Then one of the more important disclosures is liquidity and availability. A few years back, FASB came out with a new nonprofit standard requiring this disclosure so that people managing or people on the board can see how much money do we have and how long could we last without additional new monies. So you're going to see the more liquid assets in here, and then there's some reductions here to get you down to the financial assets available to meet general expenses for the next year. Obviously, the larger this number is, the better. So you want to look at that liquidity note. Then we get on down here and we see some disclosures about contribution receivables. You'll see here the unconditional promise at a gross number, and then it's broken down here by 1 year or more than 1 year. Then we go on down and we see prepaid assets, fixed assets. So if you want to know what fixed assets they own, you can see that here. Then they talk about the intangible assets being software. And then finally, they're telling us about the line of credit. So if they need to borrow some money, they're disclosing that information. And then they talk about board designated funds, which is quite common in a not-for-profit. Finally, we see net assets with donor restrictions. They're giving us a breakdown of what those numbers are, and then they're showing the amounts that were released. You remember seeing that release in the statement of activities. They're showing where that money was spent. On this page, we see information about the endowment, and again, that's quite common with a not-for-profit. They're giving some breakdowns of where that endowment is restricted and invested. Then finally, they're telling us about the pension plan for the nonprofit employees, and then they give us information about the leases, the right of use asset, and the lease liabilities. Okay, and then finally, they're telling us about the government grants. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.